is intended to give only a first quick glimpse of Peru's extraordinary coastal pyramid cities.
A couple of coastal pyramids are now stepping into view with a weight that's hard to ignore. Graham Hancock's latest work points straight at a stretch of Peru that rarely makes headlines, yet he says it holds evidence that forces a serious rethink of the past.
It was still almost completely covered under the municipal rubbish dump of the nearby city of Supe.
His new material comes from a recent trip along the Pacific coast, where he focused on several ancient sites that researchers have been studying for years. According to him, what's coming out of that region isn't a small update. It signals something larger, something that challenges what many people assume about early civilizations. He keeps hinting that the real turning point lies deeper in the story. It's a detail that pulls everything together, and it will leave you speechless. A first look at the timelines. When Graham Hancock sat down to review the published radiocarbon sequences from Peru's coastal sites, the pattern that emerged was difficult to ignore. The numbers came from archaeological reports, not from speculation, and Graham kept returning to how early some of them were. The more he compared the data sets, the clearer it became that the coastline carried monumental activity far deeper in time than most viewers ever heard about. It was the kind of detail that lived in technical papers, yet rarely reached a wider audience. He focused on the samples tied directly to construction. Corral had produced a solid backbone of early dates from sealed layers inside major structures. Aspero carried ranges that overlapped enough to show that coastal and inland centers evolved in the same general era. Bandurria introduced even older material, taken from buried floors that preserved the moment the builders left them behind. Individually, each site was important. Together, they formed a picture of architectural planning that appeared early in the 3rd millennium BC. Graham understood that the significance did not rest on a single test. It rested on the accumulation of results across several valleys. The timelines repeated, sometimes with small variations, but always in ways that reinforced the idea that something organized had taken shape along the Pacific long before most people associated Peru with large-scale construction. The dates were calibrated and tied to real layers, and when Graham placed them side by side, they suggested that the history of monumental buildings along this coast began far earlier than the public narrative ever acknowledged. The people who brought the coast to light. You see, archaeologists have been slowly uncovering what was hidden along Peru's shoreline for decades, and one of the main figures leading that work is Ruth Shady Solis. She started studying Corral, one of the earliest known urban centers in the Americas, back in 1994, and kept digging for years. Ruth's team focused on understanding how these cities were built and how people lived there, carefully peeling back layers of soil to see the story of construction and occupation over time. Ruth's method was straightforward but meticulous. She and her team studied the different layers of earth beneath the platforms and plazas, which showed them the order in which things were built. By looking at these layers, they could tell which structures came first, which were added later, and which had been repaired or modified. Think of it like reading a timeline written into the ground. Every layer told a story. Sometimes it was about construction techniques, other times about how the people who lived there adapted their city over generations. You can almost picture the city growing step by step as you read the layers. To figure out actual dates, the team used radiocarbon testing. They collected organic material from construction layers, things like reeds, plant fibers, or other remains, and measured the decay of carbon-14 to estimate how old it was. Because raw radiocarbon numbers don't line up perfectly with calendar years, they used calibration curves to adjust the results. This gave a more accurate idea of when specific structures went up. If you've ever wondered how archaeologists put a timeline on something buried for thousands of years, this is exactly it. Testing, calibrating, and cross-checking to make sure the numbers match the story told by the soil. Even the early reports from Corral made it clear this was no small settlement. Monumental constructions, sunken, circular courts, plazas, and massive platform mounds showed that these people had a level of planning and organization that completely changed what researchers thought about early urban life in the Americas. Corral was a hub of coordination, labor, and culture. Imagine a city with carefully designed public spaces, buildings aligned along clear axes, and communal structures where people came together. It shows a society that was thinking far beyond simple survival.
It's part of the ancient city of Corral, believed to be the oldest in the Americas.
Of course, Ruth's work didn't stop at Corral. She and her team looked at nearby sites along the coast and river valleys, noting similarities in construction, layouts, and materials. Sites like Aspero and Bandurria revealed comparable stepped platforms, sunken courts, and evidence of social organization. Slowly but surely, the patterns started to show that this wasn't a single, isolated city. It was part of a network of connected settlements. Trade, culture, and planning seemed to link them together. The way Ruth ran her digs mattered too. Every layer was carefully documented before removal, and every sample was logged so other researchers could check or expand on her work. That level of detail meant the findings were solid and could be trusted. And it wasn't just about dates and layers. The team recorded tools, pottery fragments, quipu-like objects, and even traces of early agricultural activity. All of it helped build a picture of the lives people led and how the city functioned on a daily basis. By the end of years of fieldwork, Ruth and her team had not only uncovered massive platforms, but had also mapped how whole communities developed along the coast. They found evidence of roads connecting different parts of the city, storage spaces suggesting large-scale food management, and even the foundations of homes built for extended families. It's worth noting that yes, what Ruth and her team uncovered is about stones and soil, but it's also about people, their choices, and the way they built lives in challenging coastal environments. Seeing how they organize their communities, you start to realize there's a bigger story here, and that story continues as we turn to the neighboring sites, where more clues await and where the patterns Ruth uncovered start to stretch beyond a single valley. Coastline full of clues. The first sign that something unusual had happened along this coast came from the ground itself. The shoreline north of Lima told its own story long before anyone tried to explain it. You could stand there, feel the dry wind, and look across land that hid a chain of ancient communities, each leaving behind its own layer of evidence. They all carried weight, and they all kept scholars busy, especially once teams began tying radiocarbon dates to the structures rising out of the sand. If you followed the valleys one by one, the pattern became clear. This coast wasn't quiet. It was busy, organized, and active much earlier than anyone expected. Aspero usually came up first whenever people talked about these coastal centers. At the start of the 1970s, the site drew a lot of attention because it sat right on the shoreline and showed signs of a fishing and ceremonial hub. Excavations revealed platform mounds, public spaces, and dense layers of fish remains, confirming that sea-based resources fed the whole system. Radiocarbon samples pulled from architectural layers and refuse zones often landed between roughly 3000 and 1800 BC. Those ranges lined up with the construction sequences on the mounds and turned Aspero into one of the earliest documented coastal settlements with large-scale public buildings. Bandurria, farther south in the Huara Valley, added even more heat to the discussion. When excavation teams returned to the area in the early 2000s and took new samples from buried walls and sealed floors, the numbers pointed even earlier. The radiocarbon series placed several of its phases around 3200 BC in published reports, which caught everyone's attention because it pushed the timeline for monument building along the coast into deeper territory. The site held stepped structures, sunken courts, and architectural features that showed a level of planning not usually linked to that stretch of shoreline. If you walked through the exposed pathways, you would notice that each building sat in alignment with another, suggesting that it wasn't a random construction. Those dates, pulled from charcoal, plant fibers, and construction fills, were the kind that made you pause. They forced you to factor Banduria into any serious look at how early coastal groups organized themselves. Peñico came into view more recently. Project leaders working across the wider Corral zone released updates describing it as part of the same network of settlements, but younger than places like Aspero or Banduria. Even so, the site drew interest because it showed how the region didn't rise all at once. It grew in layers. Peñico held structures that reflected continuity, not rupture. Public buildings, planned spaces, and signs of long-term occupation. Teams recorded its ceramics, building styles, and surface patterns, tying them into later phases of development.
8 years of research at the site unearthed 18 structures, including ceremonial temples and residential complexes.
It didn't rewrite timelines, but it showed the spread and reach of those early coastal centers. When you stepped back and looked at everything together, something stood out. These sites weren't isolated dots on a map. They formed a cluster stretching across several valleys, the Soup, the Huara, and others nearby. Radiocarbon analyses from different teams produced ranges that sometimes overlapped, sometimes sparked arguments, and sometimes forced people to revise old assumptions. That kind of push and pull happened often in archaeology. Labs calibrated numbers, cross-checked samples, and compared them with stratigraphy and construction orders in the field. What mattered most was that each of these sites carried early dates tied directly to architectural contexts. Those weren't guesses. They came from sealed floors, buried walls, or materials locked in place during building phases. Scholars didn't always agree on how to rank the sites by age. Some argued that the earliest Banduria phases reached back farther than the well-known Super Valley centers. Others pointed toward Aspero and emphasized the strength of its fishing economy as the foundation for early public architecture. The debates kept going because each excavation season added new data, and each new set of samples introduced another angle. If you followed these discussions, you would notice that the disagreements rarely dismissed the sites themselves. Instead, they refined the interpretation of their sequence. The presence of these early centers remained solid. For anyone standing on that coastline, the significance was easy to feel. You had multiple settlements with large public buildings, organized layouts, and radiocarbon dates that placed them deep in time. These weren't camps, outposts, or temporary fishing spots. They were structured communities, supported by a mix of marine resources and inland ties. The fact that several valleys carried similar time ranges told you this wasn't the work of a single isolated group. Something bigger was happening along that stretch of the Pacific. This cluster created a foundation that later research couldn't ignore. It set the framework for understanding how these ancient coastal societies operated, how they expanded, and how they interacted. The early dates, the layout of the buildings, and the range of sites all pointed to a coastline filled with activity and planning. And as teams continued to publish their findings, the picture grew more layered, hinting that the region still held pieces no one had placed yet. Those missing pieces would lead straight into the next part of the story, where the terrain shifted, and the evidence took on a different shape, one that pushed researchers into new arguments and new ground. The weight of the timelines. The moment the dating numbers came together, the conversation changed. Radiocarbon samples from different corners of the Soup Valley lined up in a way that caught both archaeologists and outsiders off guard. Graham Hancock took those numbers and pointed straight at the comparison everyone tried to tiptoe around. He had filmed the step pyramids at Corral, Banduria, and Aspero, and he said the quiet part out loud. These structures belonged in the same global discussion as the earliest monumental sites in Egypt and Mesopotamia. He based that on published ranges that had already circulated in academic papers, and he pushed the idea that the Andes held something far older and far more organized than most people expected. The earlier Corral studies gave the clearest backbone. Excavations led by Ruth Shady Solis produced a series of radiocarbon dates tied directly to architectural layers. Calibrated results placed monumental construction at Caral, roughly between 2627 and 1977 BC. The methods were standard. Charcoal samples from construction fill and architectural context were sent for radiocarbon testing. The lab results were calibrated to compensate for fluctuations in atmospheric carbon, and the ranges were published so future teams could compare them against new material. The dates appeared repeatedly across multiple samples taken from different parts of the site. Aspero, down at the coast, carried its own line of evidence. Excavations there produced occupation windows, often placed between around 3000 and 1800 BC in published reports. The site held mounds, platforms, and signs of a long-running community tied to both maritime resources and inland networks. When researchers talked about Aspero, they usually framed it as one of the earliest coastal centers connected to the wider Supi system. And even though the numbers from Aspero weren't identical to Caral, they did overlap enough to show that the coastal and inland centers grew in the same general era. No matter which team published its results first, the picture kept pointing in the same direction. This region had developed complex architecture very early. Once those Peruvian timelines were laid out, the comparison to Old World monuments became unavoidable. The Old Kingdom pyramids in Egypt remained the most recognizable benchmark. The Great Pyramid at Giza, built for Khufu during the 4th dynasty, dates to around 2580 to 2560 BC. The Step Pyramids and earlier complexes of the 3rd dynasty sat just before that, marking a clear and well-documented tradition of monument building. The chronology was firm, supported by inscriptions, king lists, and extensive archaeological work. In Mesopotamia, monumental ziggurat architecture appeared during the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BC. Sites in the Uruk and early dynastic periods introduced the large stepped structures that became iconic in later kingdoms. Although some buildings were rebuilt multiple times, the basic tradition of staged temple towers stretched deep into that early window. Scholars relied on stratigraphy, clay tablet archives, and radiocarbon-backed sequences to keep the dating consistent. This was where Hancock placed his claim. He said the Peruvian coastal platforms were as old, or even older, than some of the earliest Egyptian and Mesopotamian monuments. He pointed to the radiocarbon ranges from Caral, the long coastal sequences from Aspero, and the surrounding sites, whose dates continued to fall in the same general period. His argument rested on the idea that when you lined up the numbers from these different parts of the world, the Andes entered the conversation at the same scale as those famous Old World centers. It didn't erase the achievements of Egypt or Mesopotamia, but it challenged the idea that monumental architecture began only in those regions. This was where the ground shook for many viewers. Hearing that these platforms stood on timelines close to Giza or the early ziggurats made people look at the Andes differently. In fact, many point out that Peru's coastal pyramids are rewriting history and the past you thought you knew. And honestly, this is surprising. The questions that still need answers. Once the dates were lined up, attention moved to the people who worked with this material every day. Archaeologists didn't ignore the early timelines, but they kept stressing one thing: dates only mattered when the samples behind them were tied directly to construction. Radiocarbon results needed to come from sealed fills or building layers, not from occupation debris that could drift out of place over centuries. Ruth Shady Solis made that point early in her own work. After she and her team gathered some of the first radiocarbon sequences from Caral, Ruth pushed for more precise testing, especially from layers actually used during construction. She encouraged others to look closely at where each sample came from, how it was sealed, and whether it truly reflected the moment a platform or pyramid went up. Her message stayed consistent. One good sample informed the conversation, but a full set of well-documented samples strengthened it. Archaeologists studying Aspero and Banduria reminded everyone that each site followed its own timeline. Some layers showed long, steady occupation. Others revealed distinct pulses of building activity. Even if the dates overlapped, the development patterns weren't always identical. That meant researchers needed broader sampling across all sites before drawing any conclusions about which center rose first or how closely their histories matched. Specialists also pointed to calibration windows. Radiocarbon numbers needed to be converted into calendar dates, and those conversions sometimes created wider ranges because of ancient atmospheric conditions. The ranges were accurate, but they weren't single-year timestamps. For comparisons across continents, that mattered. A calibrated window could overlap with old-world timelines, but it still represented a span, not a fixed moment. Attribution raised more questions. Some researchers saw Caral as the central hub because of its size and planned layout. Others argued that Aspero played a major role earlier on because of its coastal economy and long fishing history. What stood out was that no single site could explain the whole story. The super-region functioned more like a connected cluster.
The sites here in the Supe Valley are continuing to introduce new discoveries and provide new context for the ancient civilizations.
And archaeologists wanted more data before assigning clear priority to any one location. Then came the practical challenges. Preservation and funding shaped what researchers could study. Certain areas faced erosion and modern pressures, and some structures needed stabilization before excavations could continue. Even Caral required routine maintenance because the sun and wind slowly wore down exposed surfaces. Specialists made it clear that future progress depends on keeping the sites intact long enough for deeper, more targeted work. When you step back from the debates, you can see that no one dismisses the significance of the early dates or the scale of the monuments. They agree the coast held enormous potential. They just want to be sure every claim rested on solid ground. What if? Reports circulating in research circles point to one conclusion. If the early monumental dates from several Peruvian coastal platforms stand up to full scrutiny, the field enters a new phase. Specialists working across Andean archaeology say this would mark a turning point in how early monument building is explained, and they outline direct consequences that would follow across multiple subfields. The first implication lands on long-standing assumptions about how large-scale construction spread around the world. For decades, scholars treated monumental architecture in the Old World as a reference clock for early complexity. If coastal Peru shows comparable timelines, diffusion-based explanations lose their standing. Researchers already working on early Andean sites say this does not imply isolation or contact. It simply means that early communities in the region reached urban-level coordination through their own pathways. The shift would push new studies toward internal development models, not external triggers. Another implication concerns the position of the Pacific Coast in early social organization. If secure dates confirm simultaneous or earlier construction relative to Old World monuments, coastal economies become central in discussions of urban origins.
What's being discovered in Peru is rewriting world history, which is precisely why these mysterious coastal cities.
Teams studying the region emphasize that maritime resources, short-distance trade, and seasonal labor systems may have supported organized construction efforts well before highland states emerged. This would move the conversation away from agriculture-first frameworks and toward a model grounded in coastal productivity and community management. A further effect falls on global comparison. Should the dates prove sound, researchers working on sites in Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, and the Indus region will need new frameworks for cross-regional analysis. Current comparative studies rely on staggered timelines that place Andean developments well after Eurasian ones. Revised dating would flatten that structure and scholars say this demands new attention to shared challenges rather than presumed lines of influence. The challenges include water management, labor coordination, ritual leadership, and long-term site maintenance. With these implications in view, specialists outline a clear set of priorities if the field is to reach consensus. The first priority is securing stratified samples directly tied to construction phases. Recent debates in the literature show that samples coming from fill deposits, abandoned floors, or later renovations cannot anchor a building's original date. Field teams now call for core samples, sealed construction joints, and material taken from structural layers that cannot be moved or reworked after initial building. The second priority centers on independent lab programs and transparent calibration procedures. Several American labs and European facilities already process Andean samples, but researchers stress the need for parallel runs, shared protocols, and full publication of calibration choices. Minor shifts in calibration windows can move dates by centuries, so clear reporting is essential for long-term acceptance. Specialists also stress that labs must publish error ranges and replicate tests on the same sample type to remove doubts about lab-specific variation. A third priority is building multidisciplinary studies focused on materials and subsistence. Archaeologists, geologists, botanists, and marine biologists all hold parts of the picture. Specialists want coordinated studies on construction materials, quarry sources, faunal remains, botanical evidence, and soil chemistry. These data sets show how people supported labor crews, moved supplies, and sustained long-term construction projects. When combined with secure dates, they can confirm whether early monument building rested on stable food systems or short-term surges of organized labor. The fourth priority concerns conservation and community involvement. Several coastal sites face erosion, looting, informal construction, and fluctuating funding. Field teams report that fragile architecture made of adobe, reed, and lightly compacted earth cannot withstand uncontrolled visitation or neglected maintenance. Community-supported preservation programs are now considered essential. Local involvement brings site monitoring, educational outreach, and stable stewardship that state agencies cannot always guarantee. These priorities feed into a closing concern. Preservation and clear publication have become urgent. Scholars warn that without detailed reporting, open data, and steady conservation, early findings can be lost or misinterpreted. Once data is recorded and shared, it becomes part of the permanent record, reducing the risk of distortion and giving future researchers a firm base for new work. But if the early dates hold, the field enters a moment where long-standing assumptions are reassessed, and the global timeline of monument building takes on a new shape. The question now is simple. How will this shift change the way we understand the earliest organized societies? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.